And just so you know, like we're recording this because I wanted to get it up on YouTube on the AGA site, just to have a bit of a library, if you will, of all of this program, and perhaps we can even extract the transcript out of it. My son is almost 23 and pretty savvy at using the various tools to do that. So, is anyone opposed to? Hi, welcome. We're just getting going. So, did that work? Okay. But we just went around the room introducing ourselves, and if we have a business or we're looking at starting one, and where in the valley we live, would you be willing to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi, my name's Sika. I just moved here about a week ago, and I have had several businesses. I don't have one right now, but about to start an Oregon LLC. So yeah, this just seemed inspiring, and wanted to meet some folks.
Awesome. Well, a little bit of background about myself. I've lived here, this is my 29th year here in Williams. When I first moved here, I started 7 Seeds Farm, and that we've grown a whole wide variety of produce and medicinal herbs and contract seed and wholesale produce for restaurants and the co-op and stuff. And then over time, kept moving more and more and more into doing seed production until 2009 when I started Siskiyou Seeds. And then those are really like parallel businesses, the like produce part of the farm and doing wholesale seed production and medicinal herb production, and then also a pretty big orchard that we'd sell fruit through a cooperative. So that's another business that maybe later we can get into that model. I've helped found 2 cooperatives. And in Oregon, if you have a cooperative, you can actually apply for state and federal grants as if you're a nonprofit. So it's this kind of cool loophole that way, and there's a lot of grants available. And our board president for a Greater Applegate, Allison Sexauer, is the executive director for the Rogue Valley Food System Network. So if that's something that appeals to you, she has a lot of resources of all the grants that are available. Not everyone qualifies for everything, because some of them are for veterans or things like this. But there are a lot, and they can basically hold your hand through that process, because the government doesn't make anything easy. So and now at this point, for myself, we're doing the seed company, Siskiyou Seeds, and I have a staff that helps me run that, and I'm actually finding the more that I delegate the tasks that I once did and develop standard operating procedures and that kind of thing, the better it works. And I'm about to take another step back from all of that, and even another step back from farming, and move more into consulting and all of that. So you'll find, like, as you were describing your goals, like you set out with one goal, and I just put together 10 slides here. So it's a fairly simple thing that you initiate on one thing, like, oh, I want to farm, and then over time you realize, like, oh, farming doesn't really make much money, but this part does, like a value-added element. And now I'm realizing, after 30 years of doing it full time, that the most valuable thing I have to offer is my experience. So how to have a consulting element of that. Welcome, Jeff. So I think that's a really good thing to consider, and I'm right now in a process of doing, has anybody here ever created like a 1-year goal and vision, or like 1, 3, 5, and 10-year goals? None of you? Okay, you have. And that's, I keep a working document, like a Word document, but also an Excel document with various metrics, like my personal fulfillment, family, kids, hobbies, health, like all these other metrics, because and I'll share some tools that way, because a business can be just like completely absorb all your time, and then all of a sudden you're losing on these other important elements of what is a healthy, fulfilling life. So the goal setting, I think, is a really valuable thing of like, what is the goal, how are you tracking progress, and what does success look like? So always having a lens like that. And a friend of mine who's a many-year psychotherapist suggests doing a quarterly review for yourself. So having some kind of document that you can go back to and be like, how am I doing? How much, let's say you start a business, how much of my monthly expenses is that business costing me, or income-wise, how much is it bringing in? And so you can track these things. I'm somebody, the last time I had a job working for somebody else was, I think I was 20, and I'm about to turn 53. So I've been in the entrepreneurial, like, strange realm for a long time, and that idea of that you just get a check every month that you can depend on, that check isn't then so you can pay payroll and all the other bills of running the business is a foreign concept to me. So I know some people cobble together like a family income stream with, one person doing entrepreneurialism, which is like a roller coaster, and one person having the regular, as one of my mentees through a seed growing thing I'm doing, he calls his healthcare job. So that they can cover their mortgage, and that they know they have health insurance, and just like be able to predict their budgeting and financial goals. So all of those are really valuable. And so in here in the tagline, I put her, just the subtitle is, what is the interesting problem that you seek to solve? And that comes from Seth Godin. And if you're not familiar with his work, he has an excellent podcast called Akimbo. That's just these little 10-minute, he hasn't put one out for probably 6 months, but there's a huge library of them. They're more to do with marketing, but Seth Godin basically co-founded Yahoo. And at the last minute, in the early days of the internet, he was a book publisher. He's like, I don't think the internet's really going to be a thing. You just go do this. And he went back to book publishing, and then his partner from that time gave him a t-shirt and said, I almost founded Yahoo, but I just made $4 billion, but instead I got this t-shirt and decided books were worth it. But I think that's the, because some of us are like, I love to do this, I want to turn it into a business. However, I'm going to advance the slide. A lot of you are probably familiar with this Japanese word, ikigai, which has to do with the convergence of this Venn diagram of the things you love, but like, well, what does the world need? And we were talking about like bread and bakeries earlier. What does our community need? And I know when I first started coming around Southern Oregon in the early 90s, I was intrigued at the idea of a rural place where people were doing cottage industry, farming, ranching, crafts, and basically just like the village. And in the permaculture designer's manual, there's this beautiful line drawing of like, what does a permaculture village look like? And it's, the produce shop, the soap maker. It goes back to, ancient times when a village had the cooperer, the blacksmith, the seamstress, the tailor, all the elements that comprise a full life. Obviously, everywhere the Applegate, it isn't that, like we still rely on things like Amazon and town for a lot of our needs, but I think the more that we can meet our needs locally at the farmer's market and so on, that's a solution that checks a lot of boxes. And Dr. Casey Means, who I think she got appointed to the Surgeon General recently, and she was in her mid-30s, former Stanford medical doctor, she was addressing like, well, how do you do a healthy life? And she's like, shop in a farmer's market. There's 9,000 of them in the country. And not only are you helping support your health, you're helping support keeping the money local, community, you can bring your kids, it's serving so many functions. And so back to, if you're not familiar with this, you can see the blue circle is what you love. And the pink over here, what the world needs, the orange, what you can be paid for, yellow, what you're good at. Like the orange is an interesting thing. I have friends that are musicians and are, the Rogue Suspects, for instance. My friend Greg Fredericks has been playing bass for 40 years. And he says, I still get paid about $100 a gig. 30 years ago, 40 years ago, that's what he's getting. His skill keeps going up. He doesn't need that to make money. And that's a hard thing, is music is something that you really just need to kind of win the lottery, so to speak, to make a living as a musician. And I've seen so many musicians over time who I thought were successful, selling albums, show up around here to do seasonal work. And I'm like, really? You need to do that? And so that's an important thing to consider. And then the yellow, what you're good at. And another way to look at this is what is your vocation or your avocation? So your vocation, some people just need a job. They just need to make money. Your avocation is something that you're good at. So that's the primary overlap of, you know, what you can be paid for, you know, profession here. Vocation, you know, what the world needs, what you can be paid for. Your mission, what the world needs and what you love. That's like your avocation up there. And then you can see passion, what you're good at and what you love to do. And I think these circles like move around even if you develop a business and an entrepreneurial thing. They're shifting around a little bit because, like, I know for myself, our seed company revenue, as much as I can try and budget, it goes up and down with various factors that I have no control of whatsoever. Mm-hmm. So we'll get into that kind of stuff. But I think it's useful to come back to these tools in permaculture. We say design from patterns to details. And in nature, everywhere that is happening. You'll even look at like atomic structures, molecular structures. Like we're all made of atoms. Those atoms make molecules. The atomic chart, it's all the same ingredients that make all this stuff. And then as we get to a more granular layers of all this kind of stuff, those patterns are going to show up as a more detailed iteration of that. So, but it's useful to return back to that, the patterns in nature, because they're everywhere. Like we share 99% of our DNA with a chimpanzee, but we share 70% with a carrot. You know, so obviously those small amounts make a big difference. So I'll kind of shift around here and just for my own personal story, I've always just loved working with plants and not on a big commercial scale. And I've done some farming like that. Like this is from a basil trial we did a number of years ago. And I like sharing my passion about it with people. So when I was doing more wholesale production, it didn't bring people around because our market was literally putting the seeds in a box and mailing them. So I wasn't even really interacting with my clients that way. So as we've shifted doing the seed company, I've found a way to, like, if we go back to the Ikigai circle, I had to shift the circles. But when I was doing wholesale production, it worked well when I had young children because it enabled me to stay home. I wasn't doing the hustle of going to farmers markets and all that kind of stuff and being away from my family. So that became Siskiyou Seeds, which has been a means to many ends. And, you know, Machiavelli was famous for saying, if the ends justify the means, and that's where we get the saying, by all means necessary. So, where Gandhi came along, and ironically, Machiavelli was friends with Da Vinci, and they would hang out together. So
there's been some interesting conversations.
Yeah, totally. Machiavelli was much younger, but they were all like in the court of the Sforza and the Medici, you know, wealthy elite. That you can think back to like what you can get paid for. Like think of art and a lot of, you know, the sculptures and all that. You had a patron. You didn't never have to sell anything. And back then, painters never even signed paintings because it was always on commission. And one painting might be multiple artists all working on things. So we're in a very different time than that. So those are, you know, back to shifting around our objectives and stuff. And that's why I think having these patterns as a way of viewing things. One of the things I've been looking at using as a metaphor for all this is, if you're old enough to remember, your home stereo had a like equalizer with all the sliders on it. You know, and so your sliders, like you're about to become a mom, like, oh, I want to be home more. So you're going to move the like home slider up. If you're an extrovert, you the home slider, you're like, no, I don't like being at home. I get lonely and I miss people. And so think about that. Like, what's your own personal equalizer? Like, what are those things? And go back to then your Google document for your 1-year plan for your life, or your 10-year plan, or whatever it is. And the sliders become the elements of your life, like time outside, time exercising, time with my family, or, you know, how do you structure your life? A lot of people never even stop to think about it, and we're not taught this in school at all, of how do you design your life. That should be like in high school. That should be one of the periods. You go to biology, math, how do you design your life? You know, most people just wind up doing a life that someone else designed, and they need somebody to do a job. A really valuable metric, this again I'm getting from Seth Godin, there's a distinction between freelancers and entrepreneurs. An entrepreneur creates jobs. You know, so you might have to do the job for a while. I used to fill these packets myself. I used to build all the seed racks myself. And then eventually I'm like, I don't have time for this, I'm not actually that good at it, I want somebody else to do it. Whereas a freelancer does jobs. Like a freelancer, a good example would be a photographer. They get hired to go do a job. Maybe at some point they shift into being an entrepreneur and they have a wedding photography business with multiple photographers under them, and they've created jobs and they take a step back. And I think that's a good thing to consider as you're doing multi-year planning for a vision of how to start a business. And this is where right at the get-go you should be thinking about, where does this go if I'm starting here. At first I was just like, sure, I'll start a seed company. And then I didn't realize how much time at my computer I'd be spending, how much time at my desk, all these, because no one shared this with me, and I didn't sit down and do the exercises I'm encouraging you to do. Of just think about it, like, okay, you want to have 700 varieties on your website, that means each one needs a variety description and a page on the website, and that's a lot of computer time. And then, I'll spare you the details. Another thing with all this, I'm just gonna let this play. At a certain point, like my passion for doing education, we were like, we're gonna start this business. This is so awesome. We did next to no market research, except that folk schools are popular in Europe to preserve old traditions, like making linen or barrels or something. So this was maybe 2017, we were gonna start this thing up. It's just a super short video. I don't know.
One of the things that we are offering an opportunity to dive into is to connect with true mentors that possibly could become lifelong friends. And then each of them represents a whole constellation of their life experience and the other people that have taught them and all the stories that go along with that, to rekindle a confidence in oneself, the self-esteem, the belief in our ability, so that if you can learn how to, for instance, make a basket, all the way from understanding how the willow grows, how to propagate it, the different species, to the different techniques and weaving and the stories and the songs that go along with that, then those are skills that you carry with you for your life, so that we understand an element, a skill, a material object in its context, so that it's not just a utilitarian item, it's part of who you are.
So what's interesting with that is we just found there was no way to make it really fly for us. And maybe it's just, it wasn't the right timing, but that was like a business that we put a bunch of work into and it never made $1. So I think that's, as that saying from Zen goes, is the master has failed more times than the beginner's even tried. So even, you have to try though. And some of us just have that burning passion to be creators in a way. And we use this term in marketing, consumers. But if a fire consumes a forest, where really, if we think spiritually, if this is, go back to that ikigai thing, what is your dharma, what are you here to do? Then you're a creator, you're not a consumer, you're creating opportunities for people to engage with your genius and your brilliance and what you're passionate about. And I think being in that lens is really valuable. And so, yeah, sure, that didn't work, but now I'm looking at it maybe 8-10 years later and shifting into doing more consulting and teaching and that kind of thing. And just yesterday for coffee up in Portland, I got an invite to go back to Africa and Kenya and South Africa and be part of doing whole systems design to coordinate regenerative things. So doing this, instead of doing it at my farm, but doing it where the impact is so much greater and somebody else organizes and pays for it all. So I think all this stuff is iterative. So maybe this is still a line on my 10-year vision, but it's how much of my time am I going to be able to devote to it, or how will I get the partners to be able to do that? So hopefully that's helpful. And another way this showed up was just continuing to do on-farm education. This is a Seed Academy cohort a number of years ago. And that has actually been a good income driver for us on the farm over the years of doing on-farm education and developing the infrastructure to do that. So sometimes it's oh, not like this, or you're talking about soap, they're selling it at the market, but there's also getting some accounts or starting a website. What are the other ways that can show up? And maybe you need to try all of them in order to see that. And this is from a number of years ago, and I have another iteration coming up, and that's gonna be the last time I do it. I just realized like I need to close this chapter because it gets a little stressful. I don't like doing the admin part. And that's one of the things you realize over time of like, oh, I got into this to do teaching. I didn't get into it to herd cats to get people to sign up. That part's not fun. So unless you can outsource that part. Back to the question of like, what is the interesting problem that you seek to solve? This is my friend Markiel Lutera. He was an engineer by trade, but he didn't like being an engineer and working in that field, so he went and worked on a farm for $20 an hour. My friend Frank Morton co-invented salad mix. So here's another thing, back in 1981, there was no salad mix. And so he was, him and another old friend, Mark Music, up near Corvallis area, they were making salad mix with no lettuce in it. So like mint tips, borage flowers, calendula, all the Asian mustard greens, arugula, and nobody used or ate those things. And they were selling that for $25 a pound in 1981 to high-end restaurants that they next day air it to in Boston and New York City. But then he ran out of seed of that stuff. He's like, well, we need to grow seed of things like tatsoi and mitsuna and cress and all these unusual things because we can't get them. That became a seed company. And then Mark A.L., after watching him winnow with just a box fan and just, Rubbermaid containers, is like, I think I could design something that would do that way better. And so that became this, that you can see is just basically plywood and 2x4s. And it was a very precision winnowing machine called the Winnow Wizard. And so I have one of them. There's, I think, a few here in the Applegate, and it works incredibly well. So he was selling these, so that became a business. And all of us in the small scale seed world bought them because we were like, wow, this is awesome. It's so helpful. And then eventually Markiel was like, I don't like constructing them anymore, and delivering this bulky thing. And I think he was charging $2,600. So it was a certain amount of money, but like, come on in.
Come on in. Don't be shy.
There's 2 chairs, and I don't know if we want to play musical chairs. So I think that's a cool example of like, here's something, how long have humans been growing seed? Like forever, really, as long as there's been agriculture? And how long have humans been growing seed since there's been electricity? So 130 years or something? And nobody'd ever, this is so simple. So these ideas, not all the ideas have been created. Just look at like music. How many notes are there in the Western scale? 12. And yet still people keep coming up with unique combinations that people find catchy. Even though in my opinion, the best music was already made a long time ago. But, so what's interesting with Mark A.L. is now he has a PDF for free. Anywhere in the world, you can download the exact plans. Here's all the cutting dimensions to construct this. Because he wanted it to be open source and for somebody in Africa or Sri Lanka or wherever to be able to make something like this. And that's been really successful. And there's been a lot of modifications. Now he has an outfit in China making it out of steel. And instead of $2,500, I think they're $5,000 or $6,000. And sure, they're more sturdy and stuff. And it seems like he's moving on to poetry. But I'll come back to that. More tools, like when you're starting a business, and I know it's not as fun to do this because we just want to go off of passion, but passion projects fail. I'm just going to come right out and say it. I've watched so many happen, especially when there's like free money, like grants and stuff, is people don't have the follow through. So SMART goals, and this is something I'm in a men's group around financial mastery. That a buddy of mine who's just way better than that. So we all got this old book that was written in the 1700s that's all about how money worked. And it's so cool because we're studying that and using this for our own goal setting so that we can't be like, well, what about the internet or this? Of like, well, no, people figured out money back then and it still applies in a lot of ways in terms of doing enterprise budgeting, charting your expenses, understanding how much do you need at the end of the day too. And I'll get to a good slide for that at the end. So if you can't read it, SMART stands for specific, Make your goals clear and specific. Measurable, you need a metric, and that's where we go back to that, like, give yourself a quarterly review. Or if you're not good at that, that's why we're doing a men's group, because we'll be like, well, Jeff, hey, you said you were gonna do that in a week. I wanna see your one pager. You know, and a little bit of a system of accountable to measure, like, okay, cool, you did your long-term financial visioning. Attainable, confirm your goals are attainable. And that's, you need to get out and talk with people. You know, if I was like, I want a seed company that's gonna make $10 million a year, it's like, well, Johnny's the biggest in like my particular arena is at $10 million, and they started in 1974. So it's unlikely I'm going to eclipse them. So that's not an attainable goal. Relevant, verify your goals are relevant, and that's again back to that, you know, is it actually a goal for you? Is it a goal for the society, for your family? If you live with others or have a family, it needs to fit inside that. And time-based, that's applying it to a timeline. And there's that really simple, I should have put it up here, but there's what is it? A goal is a vision written down, and the goal applied to a timeline, and a plan becomes reality. And it sounds so simple, but that's the truth of it. If you write down your vision, then it's a goal. If you put that goal into steps, like, okay, first I'm gonna get the LLC, then I'm gonna register the DBA, then I need a space to do my thing. You know, like, what are the steps? And then give yourself a realistic timeline and a budget, and that's how everything happens. So now, I used to walk into something, I don't go into Walmart, I use Fred Meyer as an example, and like, kind of with disdain for the whole thing, even though they had something I needed. Now I look at it with deep curiosity, like, how do they keep all these shelves full? How do they actually get people to come to work here? Because it doesn't seem like a nice place to work to me. You know, so what is the incentive? How do they handle, like, you know, just all the things, the shopping carts that hit people and their insurance policy, like, wow, you know, think of what a Fred Meyer, how this works in a Fred Meyer. Thankfully, none of us have to go from where we are now to that scale. Obviously, these are recursive, they keep going, and they grow over time. Here's another one that I've just started to play around with, and it's called the personal pentad structure. It's a little, I'm gonna put this whole thing up on YouTube through the AGA site, so you can come back to this, and feel free, I can email this little PowerPoint to anyone if you want to look into it. But I do like how it defines it in these 5 things. I've got another image that looks at this. So essence, source, end, fact, value. So the personal application of essence would, who do you serve? Source is your capabilities. You're the source. So what are you capable of? The ends, regenerative impact. I want to have an impact. The fact, you're on your community. That's where you know it's working. There's the fact, you proved it. Your community, it's happening. And then the value, you get personal fulfillment. And then a key question, whose life gets better because I exist? What unique gifts, skills do I bring? How do I leave things better than I found them? How do I strengthen the places, groups I'm a part of? And what meaning, satisfaction emerges naturally? And then a daily practice coming up. Again, you can kind of see how this is similar to the SMART goals in a certain way. So start each day asking, how do I contribute? You know, I know for myself, I just grab a back of an envelope. I'm like, all right, what do I need to do today? You know, and some of it's like, I need to call my dad. You know, or I need to reach out to one of my sons and just like check in with them and be available. You know, and that's a way we contribute. Develop and align your talents with your service. Choose actions that heal and improve systems. Show up authentically in your relationships, and let joy and abundance be the result, not the goal. And that's an interesting thing for me this year, and I'll just share a little personal anecdote of, like, Siskiyou Seeds has been, you know, anybody that's done a business knows that it's not this linear, like, growing. It's like spurts, plateau, maybe even a dip. It's this crazy on all the levels, the cash flow, the expenses, your own journey. And I see this interesting thing of, like, this year our sales for our seed company are 21% down from last year. That's a big number. I wasn't planning on that. And what's ironic, as that's deeply frustrating as the person who's at the financial controls, I get emails, texts, one-on-ones that are like, thank you so much for what you do. You're totally my inspiration. Like I get these things that there's no way to put a monetary value on it, and I need to equate it. Like I can't pay the bill with that, but maybe that gives you the extra energy to push past a hard part that might otherwise make you want to quit. And that's why I think for anybody doing entrepreneurial stuff, like I just went to this event, Tomato Fest up in Portland. There were 800 people, and I was just cutting up tomatoes for sampling for 4 hours straight. And I had a line of 50 people sampling all these tomatoes, and just talking tomatoes, and growing tomatoes, and seeds, and all this stuff. And I sold enough tomato seeds in packets to definitely make my time worthwhile. But it was a good reminder of like, I can't do the rest of the work of all the other things unless I have time with people that helps me realize the value of it. And I'm up in Portland. We all know what's going on in the news. We just talked about tomatoes for like 5 hours. Nothing else. That was so cool. I was like, this is so cool. Even people that weren't gardeners. And then there were some people like, oh God, I really like this one. Can I get seed of it? And I'm like, no, we're growing it now. And so we could have the seed later. But have you ever saved tomato seed? And they're like, no. And I'm like, do you want to learn? And so I'd make them get a brown paper bag, and I'd give them a tomato or a little cluster of cherry tomatoes and have them write the variety on there. And I'm like, describe it, but I'm like, dude, on my YouTube channel and all over the internet are little tutorials of how to do tomato seed. So those experiences were, deeply fulfilling. So I think for everyone, how can you overlay within your plan, whatever, let's say you're doing some food thing, call up the Medford Food Co-op and say, hey, do you allow people to give samples? And just have that face-to-face time. And that might be really hard for you, but it also helps you hone and refine your mission. Why is it that you do that? This is another way of viewing this kind of stuff, like what I was talking about. And you don't need to dive into this, but basically I'll just point out social capital, human capital, natural capital, financial capital, and produced capital. So each of us has wealth. Sometimes when we use the term capital or currency, we default to money. But Bitcoin and cryptocurrency is capital. My water bottle, if I'm thirsty, is a form of currency because it enables me to have a valuable resource, water, that I can take with me. It's not just money. So what is the natural capital? So for me, it's like the land. I'm a farmer. What is the human capital? It's myself and my other people that help with it, and also my clients. Or maybe somebody never even buys a single seed packet, but they tell all their friends. That's part of the human capital. So, and then your social capital is how do you, nourish that? And that's where I was saying, get out there, do a product tester deal. And then your produced capital is literally the thing. I produce water bottles, and you have this thing. And obviously financial capital is just one of those 5. And it's useful just to consider that over time, because as you develop that, as I've been trying to teach my kids, think of your reality like an equity bucket. It's not just about how much money do you have in your cryptocurrency account, but the equity, what is that? The people that if you needed to ask a favor, they'd probably do it because you've been generous with them. Kind of all those different kind of buckets where you've been developing equity over time. So that's, I think, really useful to consider. And then this is the last slide I have, and my friend who his life was an interesting journey of being a solar installer, and then he just realized he was totally burnt on that. But he used some of that skill, selling solar, and he began to do marketing work for the Menla Institute out in New York, which is Robert Thurman started. His daughter Uma Thurman, you might have heard of, the actress. But Bob Thurman's most famous claim to fame is he became friends with the Dalai Lama in 1961. And that's why we even know the Dalai Lama's name, because he started facilitating him coming here. So the Menla Institute out in New York is the premier yoga, mindfulness, meditation place. And my friend Joshua started doing their marketing, where if they had a course, they would spend $10,000 on Facebook for to run an online course, and they'd make 10 to 1 on their investment. And so he came up with this, and he shared it with me, And these are basically the 3 levers or knobs you have for your business. And we're kind of jumping ahead into marketing, but it's useful to think about, because at the center, you see where the overlap is. If the knobs are all set to the right level, it's the life you want, but with enough money, enough time, enough security, enough exposure, mental challenge, physical challenge, social engagement. For each of us, it's going to be a little different. So your foundation is, what is it you do? So for me, I grow seeds, and we put them in packets and we sell it. That's the foundation of the whole thing. You need to have that solved. Magnetics are, how do people, why are they drawn to you, your thing? There's lots of other places to get seeds. And then your amplification is, how do you make it louder? How do you get it out there? So like my friend Joshua is like, well, I don't know if this works actually anymore, but it used to work, Facebook and Meta advertising. I think it's broken now, in my view. We'll pick that up during the marketing thing. And we could blame AI as a really easy way. But how do you, as Seth Godin says, how do you make an impact with a whisper in a room where everyone's shouting? Because right now, everywhere, everyone is shouting. And I was in Kenya last year, and my colleague is older and has hearing aids and has a hard time hearing. But the Kenyans are very soft-spoken and very polite. And my friend was like, everybody, you're going to have to shout for our friend because he can't hear you. And so their shouting was like turning the volume from like 2 to like 2.5. They just couldn't do that part. Like that was just against their cultural upbringing to be loud. Anyhow, it was so funny. But I think this is really useful, and so you can think like, maybe if you don't, you're starting a new business, the magnetics doesn't exist. So this circle is way over here, and maybe there's a very small overlap. And how, you really have to, when I first started my seed company, we did a whole bunch of seed racks, and our business was like 85% seed racks. Because no one knew about us on the internet, and that was 2010 when we launched that. So the internet wasn't so much a thing back then. But seed racks were. So we were in all the Grange co-ops, all the grow shops. We had little tabletop racks, and it was so much effort. And now it's flip-flopped. We're 85% online and 15%, because we've got that down. Like we grew our online presence, and that created the magnetics. And nowadays, I think, depending on the sector you're in, how do you get on as many podcasts, and Noelle and I were talking about this, as possible? That's where people find out about you. Like no one reads books. 58% of Americans will never read a book once they leave high school, and that number's plummeting. But it's podcasts, and that, or even like short form content, little, reels and shorts. How do you just get out there? And I've been contemplating that. One of the folks I like to follow on YouTube, he does every couple days a live session, and they're super casual, just him and his phone. And he's got 1 million followers on YouTube, so there's a lot of people that tune into him, but that all like dovetails in. So for you, depending on what your skills and what you're offering is, I think this is a really good way to look at that, and just for each of us, all those lenses. And I tend to be more of a right brain thinker, so having those mental pictures is really useful. And I know the title of the class was How to Create a Business, but I think this is all the homework you have to do before you even write that check in for the DBA with the state to secure the name. Because we even discussed it when we were planning this, and Chris brought up of like, maybe the first class should be, should you start a business? Because some people are not ready for that. They need the regular job, and they're not ready to, like, I know my rhythm when I was starting this was, my kids were much younger, and they're now both young adults. It's like, do my whole day of like, get up, get kids fed, ready to school, do that, do farm, dinner, kids in bed, and then I'd go sit at my computer and work on creating all that. And I would do that till like midnight for so long. And that's what it took. And for some folks, that might not work. Mm-hmm. That time after dinner might be what makes your marriage or your partnership or friendships. That's your time for that. So looking at, you can imagine this kind of Venn diagram, like the Ikigai, like Imagine all the things in your life: kids, partner, family, dun, dun, dun. And where can you do this? And that's, I think, a really good question to ask. And just get out there and ask people that are already doing what it is you want to do. I think that's super valuable. And I know for myself, when I was thinking of starting a seed company, Rich Ochek, who has strictly medicinal seeds with his wife, Mage, he gave me just probably a dozen hours of free consulting. And so the first, we got our seed packets printed by the same people that does their seed packets. We got our seed catalog done by the same people that do theirs. Their website by the same platform as theirs. I just basically copied it because he gave me their numbers and I didn't know where else to go. We've changed up some of that stuff because our needs were different than theirs. And there was a certain point, I remember calling him and asking him a question. He's like, Don, you're a smart guy. I've already given you everything you need. From now on, it's going to be $180 an hour. And that, he wasn't trying to be a jerk. He was just like, how do you think I figured it out? Like, there's all this stuff, so I gave you the head start. And there were no programs like this, what we're doing here back then. So, and I know everybody's thing is different, but I am going to kind of close with, when I go through the farmer's market in National with my son, and we walk by the various vendors, I'm like, they should have a website. They're totally missing out. Because I know for us, let's say we make $600-700 at the market tomorrow in Ashland. We're making money online. And there's other, it's all happening concurrently. Mm-hmm. And we use the term passive income right now. And I would not say that online businesses are passive income, because you do have to do the work at some point. But you are making money even while you sleep. So I think you do, in this modern era, you can't just make belts and go to the market and sell belts. That just wouldn't work. You'd have to have an Etsy shop and all this stuff. And I think it's a distinct challenge of our modern age, because the Etsy shop, it requires, you need to take pictures of it and have the pictures be good. You need to be able to format the pictures, you need to be able to set up the things and then pay for all the apps, and then how are you shipping them, It's definitely more challenging nowadays, and money's broken. I'm just going to close with that, and then we'll do some questions. Money is completely broken. $1 now is worth 81 cents compared to a 2019 dollar. $1 now is worth 51 cents compared to a 1998 dollar. In 1964, when we went off the silver standard, the minimum wage was $1.25 an hour, and at that time, dimes, nickels, quarters, half dollars were 90% silver. So you can imagine if minimum wage was 5 quarters, $1.25. If you had 5 1964 quarters today, anybody know how much that would be worth? $45. Because silver's $42 an ounce right now. So what happened? So basically money was broken. And that's where I think, the one image, I look at it I've never been to a doctor in my whole life. I have health and well-being, and mental health is all embedded in what I do. And so that's in your own kind of master planning, visioning for I want to create a business. I stand to make this much money, or I need to make this much money to do my life. But I also I want to work outside sometimes, or I don't want to have a boss like you were sharing, or I want to have more agency in making the decisions. Ascribe value to that. Right now we're trying to scratch our heads as leaders of regions and ecosystems of what are the ecosystem services of a forest that's alive and standing versus, or a watershed. And if we don't apply value to those things, a lot of things just won't make sense because of AI and consolidation, and I just call it the Amazonification of everything, where it's just more efficient at that level. But if you have value on your time, your agency, then I think that helps justify it. And I think you have to start there, because later it'll get hard and you'll be like, why am I doing this? Oh, I talked to my friend Brian the other day. I'm going to close on this one with these questions. And we went out to dinner at that place right here, the cider place. I was like, tell me why I shouldn't quit farming. And he was like, because you love it. You can't. And I was like, damn. Which is true. It's that's why I keep coming around back to that, keep going. So hopefully you got something of value out of that, and we'll do, as long as we have time with the room.
You're good.
Okay.
Yeah, it's only 6:20.
Oh, wow, okay.
Yeah.
Oh, great. Any questions, rebuttals? Or just comments, go ahead.
I got a question back to the forms of capital slide.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily a new concept to me, and it's something that I've been kind of trying to figure out in my own journey. For example, putting a lot of effort into natural capital, because I believe so much in that, and then also valuing the other capitals, but it feels like, at times feels like a grind, because it always has to come back to the financial capital. It feels like if I'm doing the others, the financial capital is like going down. So what am I aiming for in terms of how do I know this is probably a longer discussion, but what am I aiming for to like combine those capitals so they feed back to the financial?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it seems like with the financial part that you, like for your family, and it seems like you guys are already kind of addressing this, you need to figure out like how much money we need to make every month to do our life, and how much wiggle room, because starting a business requires there's wiggle room. You don't start a business when you're broke. You know, like I need to make money, I'll start it. When you're broke, you go get a job, just because it's probably a job that you don't want to do or align with. So the financial thing is, and I think you do need to factor inflation in, that the money's going to become 5% worth less every year. And then you can begin to go into the more fluffy stuff of like, I get to work outside, or, you know, I could be home with my son instead of away at a job, you know, what is the value of that? And I mean, that's a really hard question to answer. But there's got to be numbers for this kind of stuff, like a metric. Or even, I mean, if you got super geeky on all the math stuff of weighting values, you know, in terms of the benefits of what is your, kind of going back to this other slide here, you know, just this kind of like, let joy and abundance be the result, not the goal. You know, like these other things, like how much is that versus the, you know, we all know the metrics on how sick and depressed and all this that our society is nowadays. So what is it worth to not be that? But it is, I mean, it is a strain. You know, I think that's the hard thing. It's in an era where money's broken. And so many things are being rendered obsolete through AI. I listened to an interesting talk with a philosophy and history professor where he was projecting that Gen Z will reject social media and the internet sooner than we think, as they seek authentic experiences. Mm-hmm. And like I went to a cafe up in Portland yesterday. I was telling one of my colleagues, called it was a coffee shop called Queer Plants, and they have just like all these cool terrariums and stuff, and it's like going into Pee-wee's Playhouse or something. Waterfalls and whole like caves with little dinosaurs and stuff, and the furniture was all like kid friendly and stuff. And our one friend, we went with, had a 2-year-old, so that's why we chose to go to that place, and it definitely seemed like a queer hotspot too. But I think going to Portland and just seeing that, like, somebody saw this, that no one wants, like, I don't know if you've seen in San Francisco airport, there's a robot that will make your espresso for you. No one wants that. People want to be able to bring their kid, and their kid's like playing around there with toys and plants and little like misty waterfalls while they have coffee on like beanbags and stuff. And so they were looking at that, like these kind of the more human centric elements. They were able to sell that. You know, I mean, coffee shops are important. You're going to start a new coffee shop and you think you're going to succeed, so you've got to be really creative. And by the looks of it, the place was packed, and there was like no available seats the whole time. So I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah, the money part is always going to be the hardest part. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I think piggybacking on that, that's been like my biggest challenge of like, how do I, because I have a decent job in tech, it's like, how do I go from that to, what's that bridge, you know? So I've just been working like 100 hours a week at both,
Mm-hmm.
and next year will be the first year our fruit trees are really gonna be producing, and we're gonna do markets, but it's like, it's hard because I have to like see my time as like some kind of value to that, and it's like, okay, the amount of time I've put into any of these like farm efforts, does that make sense, you know, like, and I think it is like all these other capitals that, you know, like, that help it have more value,
Yeah.
but ultimately, I have a mortgage to pay, I have 5 kids, you know, so it's like, how do I reconcile both of those things? I can't really like jump out, and then I'd be afraid that if it was failing, then I might end up like resenting
Mhm.
the work, and that's my biggest fear with like going all into farming is like, oh, this is something I love and care about, and how do you, on those hard days when you're like, shit, my sales are down, like,
Yeah.
what do you do? How do you?
I mean, it's all a gamble.
It is.
You know,
that's
it's
the hard
all a
part, you
gamble
know?
because no one knows the future.
Yeah.
I've thought about that in a lot of ways of that since being exposed to Earth First and this kind of view of humanity and nature and stuff in the 80s. I've always kind of been hedging my bets. Well, someday it's all going to collapse and I'll be proven right. But I don't really want to be that, I told you so guy. And it better work as if everything is working normal. Like I look at my life, it requires Starlink, electricity, you know, all these things for my online seed company to work. If I was just taking a donkey cart down to the market to sell seeds, it just wouldn't, I mean, the world would be so different than this. So, you know, how do you kind of hedge your bets and be like, well, no matter what, it all makes sense. And the amount of energy you put into the farm, you know, kind of grow it. In permaculture, there's another principle is develop a nucleus and then radiate outwards. Like you look at everywhere in biology, everything starts as a point. Bruce Lipton dives into this and talks, I heard him, you know, everything starts as a point, single cellular, and then it's a cluster of cells, and then we're pretty sure that like eukaryotes and, you know, like multicellular life arose out of that all of a sudden like the various organelles slipped inside a cell, and then like, oh, now it's like, you know, multicellular, and then, you know, we're an assemblage of cells with yeasts and all this kind of stuff. So I think I would love to see us get back into the idea of cooperatives, and I'm really hoping when I joined the board of AGA, I was like, I want AGA to be like the regenerative chamber of commerce, looking out for the success and well-being of all the residents here and anyone that visits. So my friend Richard Ziff of the Earth Clothing Company that started the first organic hemp clothing company in the world, he and I have riffed off this of like, imagine if there was a space like this big where people like myself had office hours, each one of us has a skill that like, all right, I do 2 hours a week, volunteer just for the thriving of future. And then the next one is we've got a podcast studio that's all set up. And then we all have a collective like, you know, Cottage Industries of the Applegate YouTube channel. And we're constantly like cross-marketing and affiliate marketing and figuring out ways so that, you know, when we talk about the money part, like, do you know how many apps I have to make my thing work? How much money I give GoDaddy for all these domain names for all these things? You know, it adds up. So what if there was a more like cooperative hub, and then our individual businesses were spokes off of that with the core business services, which is like graphic arts, web design, bookkeeping, everyone needs that. HR. And so if we could consolidate that in one central thing, it would make so much sense. And even the knowledge bases. Like when we shifted to like, all right, we want to address living wage issues, you know, what does it take to do like paid time off and cost of living, you know, stuff. And we had to like bring in an expert and pay them a lot of money, but couldn't that one template be available for all the local businesses? And so I've been thinking about that, like efficiency is how we have to, and that's how nature works. Like everything that works in nature, even though it's hard to believe when you look at a peacock or a seahorse, like evolution is efficient. It's like the best version that worked. And that's one thing, like I remember seeing out in Williams, somebody planted like 5 acres of apple trees. I was like, what are they thinking? Do they have a business plan? Or like, what are they even gonna do? And then the place was for sale, and like I'd say 3/4 of the trees died. But as somebody that has a lot of apple trees, I'm like, I know you can only sell so many apples. So but what if there was AGA or whatever that's that hub as like a think tank, like a brain trust to bounce ideas off of, and also cross market. So that's one thing I think that could help make it more efficient, so that it doesn't feel like such a crapshoot of just gambling, all that kind of stuff.
What do you think of like the Rogue Valley Food System Network? How do they do they serve any of those, like meet any of those needs?
They're trying to. I'm gonna let you in on a little secret, and sorry, my nonprofit employed friends. The people in the nonprofit sector do not understand business at all. Because it's a totally different paradigm. Like doing a business, you come up with an idea, you do the work, then you try and sell it, then you get money. And the nonprofit sector, you come up with an idea, you apply for the grant, they give you the money, then you do the thing. But and then another thing about the business world, chances are next year I'll make about as much money or more than I did this year. In the nonprofit world, there's no guarantee at all. It could go to zero. And that's a super scary part too. And I think there's pluses and I think we need more public-private partnerships. And I think like the Rogue Valley Food System Network could be doing a lot more around entrepreneurial mentorship and just letting people know how, like, what's behind the curtain at Oz. Like I talked to a friend up here, he's got 320 acres his parents bought in 1972. I won't name names, but if you drive by, you're like, that is an epic ranch. Like all organic, and I get about 10 truckloads of either hay or manure from them a year. And my friend told me the other day he was just gone for 6 weeks that he was flying a crop duster in Wyoming on ethanol corn to pay for having a ranch with 5 kids. That's all organic, but he's over there spraying pesticide, and I'm like, don't you struggle with that? And he's like, yeah, but I'd rather my kids live in an organic environment and I sacrifice myself. But he made 80 grand in 6 weeks. And there's a lot of stories like that are behind things. So I think like within the Rogue Valley Food System, next Wednesday I'm part of a meeting with Rihanna, who works with them about applying for this green infrastructure grant. And more things that are like, here's a project and we need people like you and you and you to help us do this, and we've got $250,000 here to implement it. And then the nonprofits really should be, I always say on my farm, my job is to lay the train track so the train can keep moving. Whatever that is, we need the truck to work or the thing. So so I'm having more like frank conversations with Allison and others, because it's harder now than when I started. Yeah, like our own success has created challenges because more people wanted to. It's almost like a Vince and Mary, they used to have interns for Whistling Duck. They used to be up in the Cascade foothills. And they're like, no, you can't move to the same community and start a farm, like Josh and Melissa, Tom and Maud, they were both interns there, and there's others that moved to literally the same community, started farms, and are competing directly with Whistling Duck. Like, no, go somewhere else. But it doesn't have to be that way. How can we design collaborative relationships?
Mm-hmm.
So that's one thing, like I look at, like have the online seed company, have the internet, we're shipping all over North America, and then my former students and interns, I can give them seed contracts. And they can even borrow equipment. A good way to, I think this addresses both the money thing. Douglas Rushkoff, if you ever read any of his books, or his podcast is called Team Human. And he's one of my favorite thinkers. I'm on his list to be on his podcast, but he's like on the board of trustees for the World Economic Forum. He's a digital media professor in Brooklyn. And he just says this certain thing, like I was saying, money's broken, that we need a midpoint between capitalism and Marxism. Neither work. So we can't say, oh, capitalism doesn't work, let's go back to Marxism. Just go study Stalin and the 20 million Russians that died under Stalin. And he calls that distributism. And so there's M1 money supply and M2. Does everybody know what those are? So M1 is the total amount of money in circulation. So like right now, and I've been talking about this, I actually memorize these figures because I'm watching all these young people be like, let's try and do in here what they did in Nepal. And I'm like, have you ever been in Nepal? Like that's an easy government to overthrow, I'm sorry. Their GDP in Nepal is, and not knocking it, and Nepal is amazing. And their GDP is $46 billion. That's the total amount of currency in the Nepalese, economy. You know what the US is? 314 trillion. And, we're all militarized and stuff. So that's M1 money supply, the total amount of money. But think how much of that money is just stashed in mattresses, locked up as a Rembrandt on the wall that's worth $10 million. That's not in circulation. M2 is the amount of money in circulation. And the more that money moves around, so if I take $20 out of my pocket and I buy something from you for 20, and you buy it from you and you, like we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. That $20 bill functionally becomes $200 in M2 money supply. Without, it's still just a $20 bill. So if we could do that more in the Applegate, then it's a way to raise local wealth. And the other night at a men's circle, I was like, who here shops at Costco? And like almost all the guys raised their hand. I'm like, dude, you're totally working against me. You know, and all the work I've done forever. Because there's no local food at Costco. And 98% of the food consumed in the Rogue Valley comes from outside the valley. And it's because we don't understand that idea of distributism. It's called the velocity of transactions. And where I'd love to see us go, I mean, you're in tech, and I mean, you guys should get to know one another because Noel used to be in tech. Maybe still is, I don't know. How you are. Is like, why don't we have an alternative to like PayPal, Venmo, Cash App? Imagine if we had like a blockchain thing. When I'm at the market nowadays, nobody uses the physical card. They're just like, touch the phone, especially up in Portland. I know there's probably some hoops you got to jump through, but what if we had our own version? And maybe it's still taking a 3% transaction fee, and maybe that 3% transaction fee is training programs for the youth to inhabit the next thing.
Do you mean like local, like the Applegate Valley
Currency.
payment?
Yeah.
It's challenging because you still have to relate it back to fiat currency, and that's always been the challenge with anything like that, right?
Yeah.
We still, most of our properties are owned by the bank, right? So we have to like make that payment. How does that translate?
Yeah. It makes me think, once I was in a Chinese medicine shop up in British Columbia in the Richmond area, is a really high population of Asian Americans. And I was at this huge Chinese medicine shop, like the size of, I don't know, it was big, not quite like Walmart big, but big. And young people would come in and they'd use the calculator, the digital stuff, but old people would come in, they're like, no, abacus and literally brass scale. For everything, because they wanted to see it. And so I think that's the thing, like we even talk about like, what's the value of Bitcoin? Like, oh, it's $105,000. We always default back to the fiat currency that is worthless, really. It's a dead instrument. And so that is but I do think that like, how do we get it to where we have our own medium of exchange, which you can go to jail for, like if you begin minting your own currency. But I think digitally and clearly crypto is a loophole right now, that the elites are like, we're into crypto, as long as we're not in China. So but I think these ideas and more think tanks around how do we change that, because every time we use a dollar, we're losing money, is the truth of it. But I can just imagine something, we're already used to it, the market, everybody uses the little wooden tokens and stuff. And maybe, I've been to 2 stores that were kind of like cooperative farm things. One was in Denver, and it was called the Grow House, Haus, and it was an old mushroom growing facility for like button mushrooms. And so they retrofitted it to be aquaponics, but also a whole like cooking classes in multiple languages, and people would have their daughters' quinceañeras there. Another zone, they had a whole greenhouse with like LED lights and growing all the starts for all these micro farms in the area. Like doing so many things. They still were doing mushrooms. And then they had a farm store. Next door was a Purina dog food mixing plant, and then there was a steel like mill across the street. It was a very depressed area of Denver. But you look at the parking lot, it's all like beautiful murals and art and Teslas and Porsches, and as the wealthy went to shop there. They had 3 different prices on everything depending on where your zip code was. Because Denver's big enough where there's multiple zip codes. So for the people who lived in the area, they got a discount. The people who were coming in from the affluent areas paid extra to justify that. And so what if we could encode in our blockchain thing, like, oh, you're this age, this is the price. Boomers, you're gonna pay extra.
What all the fixed income there?
Anyway, but I think, I hope that we generate more of these ideas out of all this kind of stuff.
we don't have to leave, but some folks do have other things to do, so I wanted to say thank you very much, Dawn. If you need to go, go. If you wanna stick around, stick around. I'm here for a while, but you know, sometimes people get shy and they don't
Yeah.
wanna leave. So, good.
Awesome, thanks everyone.
Thank you, Don.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Can you hit stop on that?